Throughout her life, Queen Elizabeth II ruled with grace, resilience, and a strength that few could match, leaving behind a legacy that will be remembered for generations. Yet, as her historic reign came to a close, what truly captured the world's attention was a mysterious message she reportedly received on her deathbed. What could this message have been, and what significance did it hold in her final days? Join us as we explore the terrifying message that our Lord Jesus Christ is said to have revealed to the Queen before she transitioned to the great beyond. The mysterious message which Queen Elizabeth II is said to have received from Jesus Christ before her death is covered in mystery and wonder. A selection of individuals close to Her Majesty speculate that the Queen received this mysterious message during a time of personal prayer and quiet reflection, as she often spent some time in solitude in Buckingham Palace. Some witnesses said that she was constantly speaking about Jesus all the time. Even the former moderator of the Church of Scotland, Reverend Dr. Lane Greenshields, stated that the Queen spoke at length about her Christian faith in the days leading up to her death. She was said to have reflected on the influence of her father's faith on her life, the relationship she had with Scotland, and particularly her obsession with the Balmoral estate, where she felt very much at peace in her last days. Everyone in the palace agreed that her last days were filled significantly with mystery. When she finally left, her funeral was held on September 19, 2022, at Westminster Abbey in London. It was the first state funeral for a British monarch since 1965, when Winston Churchill's funeral took place. The funeral service was attended by over 2,000 guests, including members of the royal family, heads of state, and government representatives from around the world. An estimated 1 million people lined the streets of London to watch the funeral procession, which featured around 3,000 military personnel. After the service at Westminster Abbey, the Queen's coffin was transported to Windsor Castle, where a committal service was held at St. George's Chapel. The Queen was then interred in the King George Memorial Chapel alongside her husband, Prince Philip. The Queen's funeral was one of the most watched television events in history, with an estimated 29.2 million viewers in the UK alone. The funeral was also one of the most expensive royal events ever held. Many people believe Jesus must have told Queen Elizabeth II that he is coming soon, and the year 2024 might just be his return. Some believe that perhaps he was pleased with the message of love and acceptance the Queen showed in her reign, which transcended religious boundaries as her rule drew to a close. While what was revealed to Her Majesty keeps riding on the wave of mystery, one thing is certain. Queen Elizabeth's reign witnessed the glory of the British Empire, the rise of technological globalization, and major social transformations. As the role of religion in public life shifted, the Queen remained steadfast in her beliefs. While much of British society grew more secular, she never wavered in her commitment to the Church of England. To then try to understand why it would be possible for Jesus to send Queen Elizabeth a message in her final moments, let's explore her lifetime and her deep connection with God. The relationship between Queen Elizabeth and the Church. The coronation of Queen Elizabeth II wasn't just a formal event. Rather, it was also a religious one. Elizabeth was elegantly dressed in royal regalia, a symbol of British tradition and continuity. While the coronation was a day filled with splendor and festivities, for Elizabeth, this day marked a deep spiritual commitment, a promise to uphold the teachings of the Church of England for the rest of her life. The ceremony took place in West Abbey, a place that's become part of British history, where kings and queens have been crowned for nearly 1,000 years. In that sacred space, Elizabeth took an oath. She promised to maintain the laws of God and the teachings of the Protestant faith. From that moment on, she was not just Queen of the United Kingdom, but also the Supreme Governor of the Church of England. But despite the weight of this responsibility, and however heavy it must have been on her shoulders, the Queen discharged her duties with so much elegance, grace, and great poise. Queen Elizabeth also viewed being Britain's monarch as a divine mission. It is widely believed that her coronation was more than a grand display of royal wealth and power. It was a deeply personal religious experience for Elizabeth. This is seen not just from the oath she took before the Church of England on that day, but also from the reverence she gave to the officiating priests. The Queen's belief in Christ wasn't something she only displayed in big ceremonies. It reflected in every part of her everyday life. Queen Elizabeth II attended church almost every Sunday. The British royal family attended a traditional Christmas Day church service at one of the Queen's country estates. Queen Elizabeth was joined by her son, Prince Charles, and grandsons William and Harry. She also had a personal chaplain, and whenever she was unable to attend general service, her personal chaplain provided spiritual counsel and helped with private service. She was a regular at St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. Even with her busy schedule, she was never too busy for prayer and worship, as she cherished every moment spent with the Lord Jesus. Perhaps it is the reason he reached out one last time as she drew her last breath. Queen Elizabeth II even included private devotions into her daily program, in addition to her public worship. She prayed every morning and evening, looking to her faith for direction and fortitude. Her personal Bible showed signs of frequent reading and reflection. As she had noted countless times in public, she overcame the difficulties of her position as ruler with the aid of these personal devotions. Queen Elizabeth II was unashamed of her relationship with Jesus. In fact, on the occasion of her 21st birthday, she made public commitments to serve God and the nation. Oftentimes, Queen Elizabeth II attended services at Windsor Castle to celebrate milestones in her reign and major global events, like the end of World War II. Having witnessed both world wars in human history, she strongly relied on her faith to navigate difficult times, a trait that has been a part of her lifestyle. Her faith wasn't just for show, it was a source of strength during times of national crisis like the Aberfan disaster in 1966, or the aftermath of the September 11th attacks in 2001. Elizabeth often turned to her faith to comfort her people, showing great leadership and maturity in the process. Queen Elizabeth's response to the Aberfan disaster will forever be memorable. During her 70 years on the throne, the Queen was witness to countless tragedies around the world. But there was one in a small mining village in South Wales that she never forgot. In fact, her reaction to the disaster in Aberfan was said to be one of the biggest regrets of her reign. Despite being informed shortly after the disaster struck, she waited right days before visiting the community. This delay in the Queen's response was widely criticized at the time and is something she is said to have deeply regretted. According to reports, the Queen was hesitant to visit right away, fearing that her presence would distract people from the rescue efforts and recovery. When the Queen did finally visit Aberfan on October 29th, she was visibly moved and emotional. Eyewitnesses said she shed tears during her time in the village, which was highly unusual for the typically stoic monarch. The Queen also met with grieving families and survivors, showing great humility for a highly esteemed monarch. She was handed a bouquet of flowers by a young girl with the heartbreaking inscription "From the remaining children of Aberfan." This moment had a profound impact on the Queen. and she is said to have remembered it vividly for the rest of her life. Queen Elizabeth II never hid her source of inspiration from the public. She often described the life of Jesus Christ as an inspiration and an anchor in her life, and demonstrated just that in her approach to the Aberfan disaster and several other internal and socio-political traumas she had to navigate, including the death of her daughter-in-law, Lady Diana, whom she loved so dearly. She saw the Lord Jesus as a role model who stretched out his hands in love, acceptance, and healing. Another important part of the Queen's way of life was the way she respected everyone's opinion and decisions. And although she always spoke about her faith and assessed situations by it, she never imposed any restrictions on others or judged others for their decisions. According to her, Christ's life had taught her to seek to respect and value all people of whatever faith or none. She had an inclusive approach to life, pointing to Jesus as an inspiration for people of all beliefs and saying that his love is a universal commodity. She also believed that those who follow him must understand this as well in their dealings with others. Queen Elizabeth II recognized the importance of religious diversity in the United Kingdom, and as such, she made efforts to engage with and support other faiths, including visiting mosques, synagogues, and temples during her travels. The late Queen also spoke of her personal accountability before God and how she desired for people to feel the power of God's love. The teachings of Jesus Christ were foundational to her life and her reign, showing just how deeply she valued her connection to God for her. It wasn't just about fulfilling her role as a monarch, it was about staying true to herself and her beliefs. Meanwhile, some people would argue that the Queen's devotion to the gospel of Christ was a result of her upbringing. How true is this? The formative years of Queen Elizabeth. Elizabeth was born in Mayfair, London, during the reign of her paternal grandfather, King George V. She was the first child of the Duke and Duchess of York, later King George VI, and Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. Her father acceded to the throne in 1936 upon the abdication of his brother Edward VII, making the 10-year-old Princess Elizabeth the heir presumptive. She was educated privately at home and began to undertake public duties during the Second World War, serving in the Auxiliary Territorial Service. Queen Elizabeth II's faith as a Christian has been significantly shaped by both her upbringing within the royal family and the influence of her father, King George VI, on her religious beliefs. As a member of the British monarchy, she was exposed to the traditions and customs of the Church of England from a young age, fostering a strong foundation in Christian values and principles. However, it was her father's own deep faith and commitment to God that played a major role in nurturing her spiritual journey. King George VI was known for his devout Christian beliefs and his dedication to his faith. He was a regular attendee of church services and actively engaged in religious practices, setting an example for his daughter, Princess Elizabeth, to follow. Growing up in such an environment, she witnessed firsthand the importance of faith in her father's life and how it guided him in his duties as king and as a man of integrity. The influence of King George VI on Queen Elizabeth II's faith can be seen in various aspects of her life and reign. Their shared commitment to the Anglican Church created a strong bond between them, with religion serving as a source of unity and support within the royal family. The king's emphasis on duty, service, and moral responsibility left a lasting impression on his daughter, instilling in her a sense of purpose and calling that would shape her reign as queen. The coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in 1953 following the death of her father was a poignant moment that reflected the continuity of their shared faith and values. Taking the coronation oath to uphold the Protestant Reformed religion established by law reaffirmed her commitment to the Church of England, a commitment that was influenced by her father's legacy of faith and service. The presence of religious symbols and rituals during the coronation ceremony underscored the deep spiritual significance of the occasion and reinforced the importance of faith in the monarch's role. Throughout her reign, Queen Elizabeth II has maintained a close connection to her Christian faith, drawing strength and guidance from her upbringing and the lessons imparted by her father. Her frequent attendance at church services, participation in religious ceremonies, and support for charitable causes within the Christian community reflect her ongoing commitment to her faith and her desire to fulfill her role as defender of the faith. In November 1947, she married Philip Mountbatten, a former prince of Greece and Denmark. Their marriage lasted 73 years until his death in 2021. They had 4 children: Charles, Anne, Andrew, and Edward. When her father died in February 1952, Elizabeth, then 25 years old, became queen of 7 independent Commonwealth countries: the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Pakistan, and Ceylon, known today as Sri Lanka, as well as head of the Commonwealth. Elizabeth reigned as a constitutional monarchy through major political changes, such as the Troubles in Northern Ireland. She also witnessed the devolution in the United Kingdom, the decolonization of Africa, and the United Kingdom's accession to the European communities. The years of her reign in colonies, however, varied over time as territories gained independence and some colonies became republics. As queen, Elizabeth was served by more than 170 prime ministers across her jurisdictions. Her many historic visits and meetings included state visits to China in 1986, to Russia in 1994, and to the Republic of Ireland in 2011. She also had meetings with 5 popes and 14 U.S. presidents. She lived a memorable life, which saw her witnessing her coronation in 1953 and the celebrations of her silver, golden, diamond, and platinum jubilees in 1977, 2002, 2012, and 2022, respectively. Although she faced occasional Republican sentiment and media criticism of her family, particularly after the breakdowns of her children's marriages and the death in 1997 of her former daughter-in-law, Diana, support for the monarchy in the United Kingdom remained consistently high throughout her lifetime. Her personal popularity was also on the high side. Elizabeth died at the age of 96 at Balmoral Castle and was succeeded by her eldest son, Charles II. Meanwhile, looking at the life lived by Queen Elizabeth II, one thing remains unclear. She reigned at a time where world politics were filled with iniquities and darkness. Yet she kept her crown, but most importantly, she remained in true service to God. What does it take to hold on to faith when the world around you is moving in the opposite direction? Let us explore Queen Elizabeth's enduring legacy in a few minutes. Queen Elizabeth's enduring legacy. The late Queen handled the challenge of modernity with grace and class, often balancing tradition and modernity in an age when the monarchy's relevance was increasingly questioned. It was clearer than rainwater and glaring to even the blind that she continued to apply her faith into her public and private life, ensuring it stayed a cornerstone of her reign. Even when it was glaring to the British populace that the Church of England was battling with a decline in attendance and debates over modern issues like equality and abortion rights were gaining prominence, Queen Elizabeth remained a force that held things together. she continued to endorse the importance of Christianity, while significantly respecting the diverse, multicultural society Britain had become. She never openly condemned anybody or any sexual, moral, or religious orientation. This balancing act wasn't always easy. For example, the question of whether the Church of England should allow female bishops was a significant issue during her reign. Meanwhile, the Church of England had been down this road before. In November 2012, it was an unspoken general consensus that enough people in the general card would vote in favor of women bishops. But in the end, they were narrowly defeated, as the supreme governor of the Church, Queen Elizabeth, had to navigate these changes carefully, showing respect for the evolving beliefs within her church, while also staying true to her own convictions. She had her own beliefs about the issue, but she claimed she suspended it to reach a compromise. Her steady walk of faith possibly gave her the wisdom to handle such delicate matters with diplomacy and grace. Also, her ability to keep faith at the center of her life, even as the world around her changed, speaks to the depth of her convictions. This wasn't just about upholding a family tradition, but living her life in accordance with her values, no matter the circumstances. As we reflect on Queen Elizabeth's life, it is clear that her faith was not just a personal matter, but a public one deeply intertwined with her role as a monarch. One of her greatest achievements was her ability to modernize the monarchy without losing its essence, by staying true to her religious convictions while embracing social change. She demonstrated that tradition and progress don't have to be at war. It is widely believed that the not-so-new King Charles would also have to navigate a similarly complex landscape, and the Queen Elizabeth's example will no doubt serve as a guide. Again, her legacy is also a reminder of the power of faith in leadership. In a world often dominated by politics and power struggles, she showed that a leader could still be guided by moral and spiritual values. Her faith was her quiet source of strength. She never forced it upon others, but it was always present, influencing her decisions and her demeanor. As the world continues to evolve, Elizabeth's reign will be remembered as a time when the monarchy maintained its dignity and relevance. In a rapidly changing world, her faith would remain a central part of that legacy, offering a blueprint for how future leaders might integrate their personal beliefs with their public roles. But now the question on everyone's mind is, after the death of Queen Elizabeth II, how is the British monarchy faring? The aftermath of Queen Elizabeth's death. In the immediate aftermath of Queen Elizabeth II's death, Prince Charles, as the heir apparent, assumed a more prominent role in representing the monarchy and carrying out official duties. As the Prince of Wales and the eldest son of the late Queen, Prince Charles had been preparing for his future role as king and had already established himself as a champion of various charitable causes and initiatives. The transition of power from Queen Elizabeth II to Prince Charles marked a significant moment of change for the British monarchy. Years after Elizabeth's death, and while the institution itself remains deeply rooted in tradition and history, there are discussions about potential modernizations and reforms that could be implemented under the new reign. More so, questions about the relevance of the monarchy in the 21st century, the role of the royal family in a rapidly changing world, and the need to adapt to evolving social norms and expectations are being raised. People are wondering what the constitutional role of the monarchy is in a democratic society. Critics argue that the hereditary nature of the monarchy conflicts with democratic principles, as the monarch's position is based on birthright, rather than merit or popular support. Some question whether a system that assigns power and privilege based on lineage is compatible with the ideals of equality and meritocracy that are valued in contemporary society. Another talking point is the cost of monarchy to the average taxpayer. Critics argue that the royal family's funding from the public purse is an outdated institutional burden. This is said to be a legacy that places a financial burden on taxpayers, especially during times of economic hardship and austerity measures. Supporters, on the other hand, argue that the monarchy brings in tourism revenue and serves as a symbol of national pride and continuity. What are your thoughts on Queen Elizabeth II and her reign?
At the moment, that Diana, Princess of Wales, has in fact been killed in that car accident.
For over 2 decades, the story of Princess Diana's final hours has been told and retold, capturing the imaginations of millions around the world. From official crash investigations to endless tabloid reports, it seemed we knew every grim detail. Yet in the shadows, one man quietly shouldered the burden of truth. Her bodyguard during her last summer of freedom, a figure tasked with keeping Diana safe, until the exact moment he could not. A secret romance. Princess Diana's life story has always been a mix of fairy tale magic and grim reality. She captured hearts with her beauty and grace, but behind her public image lay private struggles, personal heartbreak, and endless media harassment. In 1997, she embarked on a bold new chapter when she got involved with film producer Dodi Fayed, a man whose glamour seemed to match her own desire for romance and excitement. Over decades, many have questioned what really happened in those final weeks. Now, a former bodyguard has stepped forward with new claims that throw fresh light on a relationship that ended in the most tragic way possible. People always talk about Princess Diana as if they understood what she was going through. The truth, says the bodyguard, is that Diana was at a crossroads in the summer of 1997. She had divorced Prince Charles the year before, and she was eager to redefine herself, no longer just the people's princess, but a private individual in search of love and freedom. It was a kind of rebirth, one that came with the hope of escaping life behind the palace gates. Her romance with Dodi Fayed was sudden, passionate, and shocking to anyone who'd watched her before. He was the son of billionaire Mohammed Al Fayed, the owner of Harrods and the Ritz Hotel in Paris. He was also a flashy character who enjoyed mingling with Hollywood stars and throwing grand parties on private yachts. The bodyguard suggests that Dodi offered Diana an escape from the controlled environment she had always known. She supposedly felt safe stepping onto his father's yacht in the south of France, away from the typical line of photographers that took positions outside Kensington Palace day after day. When images did leak of Diana and Dodi cuddling or kissing, the tabloids went wild. Yet, according to the bodyguard, Diana was in a strangely optimistic mood during that time. She was tired of the constant lens pointed at her face, but she was also convinced she could somehow handle it. Dodi was famously generous with lavish gifts, top-floor suites, and dreamy vacations. Diana had rarely experienced a relationship that allowed her to unwind without rigid royal protocols overshadowing every move. What people may not realize, though, is that Diana had just left behind another relationship, a deeper, more private love with heart surgeon Hasnat Khan. Friends of the princess still debate whether she was truly over Hasnat, or if Dodi was simply a more public, carefree shift of direction. The bodyguard hints that she might have been torn. However, from the outside, it seemed that she and Dodi were enjoying a magical summer traveling through the Riviera. The bodyguard himself had to arrange their security, or at the very least, keep an eye on the paparazzi that followed them everywhere they went. Even though the pair tried to stay discreet, pictures of them hugging on deck frequently appeared in magazines. The bodyguard claims Diana never confirmed that she and Dodi were engaged, even though rumor had it he was about to propose. Some believe that Mohammed Al Fayed had grand visions of tying the Al Fayed name to British royalty, while others argue that Diana was committed to forging her own path and was cautious about jumping into marriage again. According to the bodyguard, Diana wanted to keep people guessing about the seriousness of her relationship with Dodi. She was certainly fond of him, and they spent hours talking about what the future might hold. At the same time, the glare of publicity around them was so severe that it felt like they were living in a pressure cooker. That tension, in the bodyguard's words, became the backdrop for the night of August 30th, 1997. Diana and Dodi were looking for a quiet, romantic time in Paris. They wanted privacy, which the bodyguard says was already in short supply. People who saw them earlier in the day remembered that they seemed cheerful and affectionate. But beneath that calm surface, the paparazzi were already staking out various exits around the Ritz, eager to get more pictures and sell them to tabloids across Europe. Diana might have acted like the constant coverage didn't bother her, but the bodyguard insists she was exhausted. Exhausted from the cameras, from speculation about engagements, from a media that seemed determined to photograph her every breath. Red flags. The bodyguard claims were ignored. Most major tragedies come with warning signs that people only recognize after the fact. According to the bodyguard, this was definitely the case. On the night Diana and Dodi died. Although so many stories have focused on the paparazzi's chase, the driver's intoxication, or even royal conspiracies, the bodyguard insists that several details could have changed everything if only someone had spoken up sooner. He points first to the overall security arrangements. Diana was arguably the most famous woman in the world, even after losing her official HRH title. She was used to traveling with skilled protection officers, who followed protocols hammered out by palace insiders. But once she stepped out of official royal circles and into a private billionaire's domain, some of those professional layers fell away. The bodyguard claims that by the time they got to Paris, security was ad hoc. Nobody seemed fully in charge of deciding which routes were safest, let alone checking whether the designated driver was in any condition to handle that responsibility. He also believes that trusting the Ritz to handle their exit might have been a fatal oversight. Dodi wanted so badly to outsmart the paparazzi that he proposed an elaborate decoy plan. 2 cars would exit from the front of the hotel, cameras flashing, while the real duo, Diana, Dodi, and bodyguard Trevor Rees-Jones, would sneak out the back in a black Mercedes. It sounds clever in theory, but the bodyguard reveals that it was put together at the last minute. The paparazzi had practically sniffed it out immediately. Some staff members, the bodyguard adds, saw the paparazzi lingering in suspicious spots. If anyone realized that the decoy plan was compromised, they didn't pull the plug. Another red flag was the condition of the driver, Henri Paul. He worked as deputy head of security for the Ritz, but that didn't mean he was fit to handle a high-pressure chase on Paris roads. Subsequent toxicology reports indicated that he had been drinking. Some say people noticed he smelled of alcohol. Others claimed he seemed calm. The bodyguard is adamant that a formal check or a backup plan should have been triggered the moment there was doubt. Instead, Dodi and Diana, under pressure, in a rush, apparently chose to trust him because they were desperate for a quick escape. Then there were the paparazzi themselves, no longer just snapping photos from a distance, but actively maneuvering through traffic, swerving on motorbikes, and racing ahead to block the Mercedes. The bodyguard claims that the night was already tense, and ignoring how bad the chase had become was a recipe for disaster. Between the late hour, the urgency to evade cameras, and the possibility of an impaired driver, everything came together in one catastrophic moment. The bodyguard believes these red flags could have been addressed. Instead, no one stepped in to call off the late-night plan or ensure a more professional driver was found. In his eyes, that's the real tragedy. A series of small, preventable mistakes that ended up costing Diana and Dodi their lives. While official inquiries often highlight specific flaws, speeding, alcohol, paparazzi aggression, the bodyguard says he saw it as an overall breakdown. Everyone was a little too confident that they could handle the situation, from evading paparazzi to controlling the route through Paris. Nobody wanted to slow down and rethink the plan. The Mercedes in the underpass. The collision in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel has become one of the most infamous traffic accidents in modern history. The bodyguard wasn't inside that Mercedes himself, but from the evidence and testimony he's gathered, including what one survivor recounts, he has painted a harrowing picture. He describes how Henri Paul raced away from the Ritz, with Trevor Rees-Jones in the front passenger seat and Diana and Dodi in the back. Chased by a swarm of paparazzi on motorcycles, they sped through city streets in hopes of buying some privacy, even if it was just for the few minutes it took to get to Dodi's apartment. The underpass was dimly lit, and often a spot where local drivers didn't expect to be going at high speed. Witnesses posted near the entrance to the tunnel said the Mercedes seemed to be traveling faster than normal, People recall the squeal of tires, the rush of engine noise, and then an awful crunch as the car collided with the concrete pillar. According to official inquests, Dodie and Henry Paul died on impact. Trevor Rees-Jones, who wore a seatbelt, was severely injured in the crash, sustaining massive facial damage that required extensive reconstructive surgery. Diana was found alive but in dire condition. Immediately after the crash, paparazzi continued to arrive. While some tried to help, others were busy snapping photos. It was one of those moments that would later be used as evidence of how twisted paparazzi culture had become. Instead of calling emergency responders, they were eager to get the perfect shot. The bodyguard suggests that the frenzy around the car might have even worsened the chaos, preventing calm, orderly rescue efforts. The bodyguard says that what still haunts him is the sound of conflicting information in the aftermath. Some bodyguards claimed to have heard crying from inside the car, while others were unsure if Diana was still conscious. A few minutes felt like hours. By the time paramedics and firefighters arrived, they had a giant obstacle course of onlookers and cameras to get through. The bodyguard points to the first responder's story, often identified as a firefighter named Galen, or Gourmelon, who found Diana still breathing inside the wreck. That, to him, underscores how close they were to saving her. She was far from unresponsive at the scene. She still had a fighting chance. But the interior of the Mercedes was crushed. The front end was unrecognizable, seats pushed forward, glass shattered across the floor. The bodyguard notes that at first glance, many people at the scene didn't realize it was Princess Diana at all. Some recognized Dodie, or they pieced it together when they saw the paparazzi going wild. For the bodyguard, it's one of the darkest ironies. She wanted to avoid the press that evening, and yet here she was, surrounded by camera flashes and strangers in her most vulnerable state. Her last words and final moments over the years. Countless rumors have circulated about Diana's last words. Some say she spoke of her sons, William and Harry. Others claim she said nothing. Then, a firefighter's testimony emerged 2 decades later, saying Diana mumbled something like, "My God, what's happened?" Or, "Oh my God, leave me alone." The bodyguard, who has now stepped forward, supports the idea that she was indeed conscious, if only for a short time, and was confused by the chaos around her. He explains that first responders rushed to give Diana oxygen and stabilize her neck. At that moment, the adrenaline must have kicked in. The bodyguard says that the image of her awake, even if somewhat disoriented, is both heartbreaking and comforting. It's comforting because she was not instantly gone. Heartbreaking because it highlights that help arrived, but still couldn't save her. He also indicates that Diana actually had a faint pulse while being transferred to the ambulance. That small sign of life gave paramedics hope that they could pull her through once they got to the hospital. He mentions how the fireman, or Galen, was stunned when he learned the victim he tried to save was Princess Diana. He had no clue who she was in the immediate moment. He was just doing his job, attempting to save a blonde crash victim with minimal visible injuries. The bodyguard insists this detail underlines why so many claims about a conspiracy to have her killed don't ring true. Nothing about the crash scene looked staged. It was chaos and confusion, and no one had a clue they were dealing with royalty. Just people in dire need of help. In the ambulance, Diana slipped in and out of consciousness. She reportedly went into cardiac arrest, prompting frantic attempts at CPR. The bodyguard has heard from those who were there that for a few short seconds, it seemed like the medical team got her heart beating again. That glimmer of hope didn't last. The internal injuries that no one could immediately see would prove fatal. She passed away at the hospital hours later, while surgeons tried to fix the rupture near her heart. To this day, people argue about whether things could have been different if Diana had been rushed to the hospital faster, or if the ambulance had used a different route. The bodyguard is honest in his stance. We'll never know. He's heard the paramedics argue that the French approach to emergency care is different from the British style, that on-scene stabilization took priority over immediate transport. Regardless, it's clear Diana was far more severely hurt than her outward appearance suggested. In the end, her final words were likely the bewildered murmur of someone who realized something horrible had happened, but wasn't totally aware of how life-threatening it was. The paparazzi dilemma. The final puzzle piece is the paparazzi. For a while, the entire world blamed them, and many still do. Some say that if it weren't for the relentless chase, the driver wouldn't have sped, and Diana wouldn't have died in that tunnel. Others argue that while the paparazzi's behavior was bad, the bigger problem was the presence of an intoxicated driver behind the wheel. The bodyguard offers a more nuanced view. In his mind, the paparazzi were definitely contributing to the tension and panic, but the entire security apparatus around Diana had collapsed under the weight of her newfound independence. He insists that the paparazzi's aggression was no new phenomenon. Diana had faced them from the moment reporters learned of her relationship with Prince Charles all those years ago. She was used to stepping off a curb while a cluster of cameras blocked her path. She had even cooperated with some journalists in the past, trying to harness the media's power to promote her charitable causes. But her romance with Dodi brought a new level of frenzy. Tabloids couldn't get enough of the millionaire's playboy son and the world's most famous ex-royal. Everyone wanted that exclusive shot, maybe a kiss, a whisper, a moment of tension. The financial rewards for such photos were enormous, spurring the paparazzi to drive recklessly through Paris in pursuit. Yet the bodyguard says it's too simplistic to say the paparazzi alone caused the crash. He points out that Dodi was also determined to slip away undetected, rushing out into the night against any better judgment. The security detail was so scattered that they ended up relying on a deputy head of Ritz security with an unconfirmed blood alcohol level. The bodyguard calls it a perfect storm. Sure, the paparazzi's pushy presence was the flashpoint, but every step up to that point was flawed. He believes that if any single safeguard had been in place, say, if a professional chauffeur with a sober background had been driving, Diana might have arrived safely at Dodi's apartment. The paparazzi were intrusive and callous, but they weren't the sole reason the car crashed at high speed. He also remembers hearing about how some paparazzi, after the accident, rushed forward with cameras instead of offering help. That, he says, is a moment that reveals how twisted the tabloid culture was. Emergency personnel had to push them back. Meanwhile, the bodyguard was fielding frantic calls from staff wanting updates on Diana's condition. Some paparazzi claimed they were just doing their jobs, while others insisted they had tried to help once they realized how severe the crash was. Regardless, the damage was done. In the months and years after Diana's death, there was a global outcry over paparazzi tactics. People demanded new laws, new protections. Yet, the bodyguard feels that the world has a short memory. Over time, sensational pictures still fetch high prices, and paparazzi culture hasn't disappeared. In his view, Diana's death could have led to a real overhaul, ensuring celebrities or public figures were better shielded from reckless pursuit. Instead, the conversation fizzled out, overshadowed by conspiracy theories, official investigations, and changing headlines. He calls the entire night a giant security failure, because so many systems that should have protected Diana left her exposed. She was no longer a royal highness with tight palace protocols, and she hadn't yet established her own bulletproof network of experienced security. Dodi's wealth and connections, ironically, did not translate into the safest possible environment. The paparazzi just turned up the pressure, turning a risky strategy into a lethal one. Confrontations with the royal establishment and legal hurdles. When the shocking car crash in Paris claimed Princess Diana's life, millions worldwide turned to the royal family for comfort and answers. Many people felt the monarchy should have offered a warmer, more transparent response to the tragedy. Suddenly, a quiet tension seeped out into the open. Private frustrations boiled over, and individuals searched for someone to blame. In the middle of this storm stood the princess's on and off security circle, a small group of men charged with keeping her safe, yet powerless on that fateful night. Eventually, one of these men chose to speak out. For years, the bodyguard had been more than just a silent figure in Diana's orbit. He knew the lines of succession, the restrictions of palace protocol, and the consequences of stepping out of place. But in the aftermath of the accident, the royal establishment tried to close ranks. That's when he realized there might be more at stake than simply defending the public image of the monarchy. Documents needed signing, hush-hush agreements were laid on the table, and he braced for confrontation. Some key palace aides wanted a smooth, simple narrative. Yes, it was all a terrible accident. Blame the driver. Condolences to the family. Let us move on. But the bodyguard felt something else brewing. countless awkward questions nobody wanted to address. Had the princess been left with subpar protection once her divorce was finalized? Why did everything feel so uncoordinated that night in Paris? Why were certain eyewitness accounts brushed aside? The tension with the monarchy did not take the form of a flashy showdown in the corridors of Buckingham Palace, but rather subtle forms of pressure. Insiders murmured about whether the bodyguard should sign non-disclosure papers. Close associates hinted that legal trouble might arise if he ever contradicted official statements. To him, it was all too obvious that some corners of the royal establishment saw him as a loose end, someone who had no official place in the firm once Diana was gone. Others within the palace were more empathetic. They quietly admitted there was a deep sadness in how Diana's final hours played out, and they feared the scandal could spin out of control if too many conflicting stories emerged. The bodyguard saw it from both angles. The monarchy had lost one of its brightest stars, and the entire institution was staggering under public grief and growing media hostility. He also became wrapped up in the complicated swirl of legal proceedings. French authorities launched an investigation into the crash. British officials monitored from across the channel, keen to see how the blame game would unfold. Paparazzi who had chased Diana's car were briefly detained, then released. Some tabloids even tested the waters of sensational conspiracy theories, claiming that Diana had been targeted by shady forces. The bodyguard recalls feeling torn between his loyalty to the memory of the princess and the rules that came with any brush against royal life. Stepping forward could place him on a collision course with powerful individuals who had no interest in seeing the official reports questioned. He wasn't alone. Other staff members, including the late Diana's aides and butlers, also faced tough choices about talking to the media or cooperating with various legal teams. A few who had once been close to the princess gave interviews that stoked further allegations of a cover-up or hints of neglected safety protocols. The bodyguard, though, wanted to keep his head above water, mindful of not just the monarchy's lawyers, but also Dodi Fayed's father, Mohammed Al-Fayed, a man determined to prove a larger plot was at work. The tug-of-war between different factions left him exhausted. Why he's breaking his silence now? After the crash, the bodyguard didn't immediately rush to the press. He was haunted by guilt and plagued by nightmares about that chaotic night in the Pont de l'Alma underpass. He knew his story could easily be twisted or overshadowed by the frenzy of tabloid headlines clamoring for shocking details. For years, he remained in the background, trying to find normalcy in a world that could not stop talking about Princess Diana's death. When he looked in the mirror, he saw the face of someone who felt he had let down the one person he was supposed to protect. No matter how many times people pointed out that he wasn't the driver, and that Diana had made her own choices that night, he still shouldered the regret. He also carried around his memories of Diana. How she sipped tea with staff in the early evening, how she quietly supported her sons, and how she faced cameras with an almost unearthly calm. But he was aware of her private pain as well. Opinions about Diana had become polarized. Some cast her as a saintly figure. Others claimed she was manipulative. He knew her best as a kind, flawed individual under too much pressure. He found it increasingly painful to watch her legacy boil down to conspiracy theories, paparazzi standoffs, and old footage of that final summer with Dodi Fayed. Every few years, major anniversaries of Diana's passing triggered a wave of press coverage. The bodyguard would get calls from old colleagues or journalists, each seeking exclusive anecdotes. He consistently refused, telling himself it was better to let the official narrative stand. But time can change perspective. As he saw documentaries and articles sensationalize the same old angles, he began to suspect that people might benefit from a fresh viewpoint. Someone who had lived in her shadow. Someone who had no interest in fanning conspiracy flames, but also no desire to whitewash the chaos of that final night. Why speak out now? He says it was a slow process, not a single event. He began talking confidentially to a therapist, struggling with the trauma of seeing the princess lying in the wrecked car, her eyes sometimes fluttering as first responders tried to keep her alive. He confesses to nights spent awake, replaying the same images. Headlights cutting through smoky air, paparazzi yelling. The terrifying moment he realized it was Diana in mortal peril. As the nightmares persisted, he felt a need for catharsis, not just for himself, but for the public that still aches when they remember those headlines. So he decided enough was enough. He was done hiding behind the hush-hush environment that typically surrounds royal staff.